Good evening. Welcome to Reimagining Portland, Parks, Public Space, Memory, Creativity, and Spatial Justice. I'm Randy Gregg, Executive Director of the Portland Parks Foundation. A lot of us have had a long day of Zoom, so feel free to stand up for a minute, find a window, look outside, and enjoy this beautiful evening. And join me in honoring the Indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral lands we stand on. The Multnomah, the Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala, bands of the Chinook, and Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It's important that we acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. And we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. So tonight we begin, or really continue, the conversation we've all been having about the future of our city. City Commissioner Carmen Rubio had hoped to be with us tonight, but as luck would have it, she had to be in a city council meeting, a very long one that I just left a little while ago, on the challenging subject of temporary shelter in our city. But she took the time earlier in the day to send us this greeting.
Hello everyone, I'm Carmen Rubio and it's my pleasure to serve as Portland Commissioner for both Parks and Arts. And I'd like to welcome you to these important conversations about the future of our city. And tonight you'll hear from two of the country's leading thinkers on creating truly just urban spaces. Tonight's guest is Liz Ogbu of Studio O, and on April 20th you'll hear from Paul Farber of the Monuments Lab. Both will speak about the difficult but necessary and rewarding process of ensuring our shared spaces are animated by the past, present, and future of all our communities. Portland's history is one that is often thought of with great nostalgia, and it's true. We have a legacy of innovative urban design, great pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, and distinctly unique neighborhoods. And at the same time, it's also true that these things were able to flourish when not everyone was able to participate equally in these things. And in fact, many of the contributions of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other Portlanders of color were not equally reflected in or had the opportunity to participate in these innovations. But today, we honor these invisible stories, or I should say once invisible stories and contributions, by making them visible and working together to continue building a Portland where we can collectively prioritize respect, belonging, and creativity. And we have a unique opportunity to do more when we bring back our city after COVID. We can continue to innovate it. Portland Parks Foundation's upcoming summer festival, the Paseo, will highlight our downtown and can serve as a prototype for other districts as well. And I know that after this long year, we'll all be ready to celebrate Portland together. I want to thank Portland Parks Foundation, Converge 45, and the Portland Art Museum, and RAC for developing this important and timely series and the think tank conversations that will follow. Thank you, and I hope you all have a great evening of imagining what we can be.
Thanks to Commissioner Rubio. As she mentioned, Reimagining Portland is a collaboration with the Portland Art Museum, Converge 45, and RAC. And together we're focusing on our parks and open spaces. Thank you to Portland Art Museum for the financial support for this evening. Another sponsor for tonight's lecture, and about 1/3 of the over 700 people watching this from across the country, is the University of Oregon's Urbanism Next conference. They're looking at the future of technology in our streets and open spaces. Welcome Urbanism Next, and thank you to the University of Oregon for your support. And thank you to all of you who offered a donation to attend this talk, and everybody here for your time and interest. Our effort to reimagine our city will start with a wide-angle view. Tonight, with the accomplished designer and thinker Liz Ogbu from Studio O, we'll look at how a true embrace of justice might heal and reshape our public spaces. On April 20th, Paul Farber, with the innovative work of the Philadelphia-based Monument Lab, will look at new approaches to civic memory. Who and what do we remember, and how and where? Around these talks, we're going to invite together small groups of folks from across our communities for a series of think tank discussions. And then we're going to try some stuff. The foundation is working to invent a new downtown festival, a series of walks, as Commissioner Rubio said, inspired by the evening strolls in some places called the Paseo, that reawaken the city as a place where all of our communities can feel welcomed. Converge 45, RAC, and the Portland Art Museum will explore processes and opportunities for realizing new memories in public spaces. And then we're going to experiment. Some things are going to work, some things maybe not so much, and we'll learn. And we hope that our work together with you and many others will reimagine our city in a way where all of our communities can enjoy pride of place. In conversation with Liz tonight and leading our first think tank conversations will be Manuel Padilla of PSU's National Policy Consensus Center. Manuel has engaged in peace building, conflict transformation, reconciliation, humanitarian development, and dialogue locally and internationally for over a decade. So I'm going to turn the Zoom lens over to Manuel for a brief introduction of Liz. And after that, after her talk, Manuel will engage Liz in conversation and interweave your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. And welcome, everybody. It's a lovely day here in Portland. And so we want to welcome you all and welcome Liz. And I'll just do a short introduction of Liz right now. Liz is a designer and urbanist and spatial justice activist. She's a global expert on engaging and transforming unjust urban environments, from designing shelters for immigrant day laborers in the US to a water and health social enterprise for low-income Kenyans. Liz has a long history of working with communities in need to leverage the power of design to catalyze a sustainable social impact. She is founder and principal of Studio O, a multidisciplinary design consultancy that works at the intersection of racial and spatial justice. In addition to her practice, Liz has held academic appointments at several institutions, including at UC Berkeley, Stanford, and the University of Virginia. She also previously served as the Droga Architect in Residence in Australia, investigating urban marginalized populations and community development practices in the country. Liz has written for and been profiled in publications such as the New York Times, Bloomberg's formerly the Atlantic City Lab, and the Journal of Urban Design. Her projects have been featured in museum exhibitions and received numerous design awards globally. Her honors include the IDEO.org Global Fellow, TED Women Speaker, Aspen Ideas Scholar, Senior Fellow of the Design Futures Council, and one of Public Interest Design's Top 100. She earned architecture degrees from Wellesley College and Harvard University. So I want all of us to be able to welcome Liz. And Liz, I kick it over to you now to set us right.
Great, thank you so much, Manuel, for that introduction, and to Portland Parks Foundation and everyone who's made it possible for me to be here. I'm really excited to both share a little bit of my work and engage in this conversation with you tonight. Randy offered a land acknowledgement in the beginning, and so I feel it's important that I offer it as well, since I am not beaming in from Portland. So greetings from Huchin, which is the traditional and ancestral lands of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people that is more commonly known today as Oakland, California. And in offering sort of an acknowledgement of this land and the people who are on it, I also acknowledge all the generations of Indigenous, Black, and other non-white bodies who have helped to make this place that I call home what it is, and whose stories have not always been valued and whose bodies have not always been cherished. And so I know that as I seek to do my own work, I hope to create places where we actually remove ourselves from not cherishing stories or bodies. And in many ways, that acknowledgement and sort of what we've been talking, everything that has been said up until this point, I think really speaks to what I wanted to talk about today. And so let's see if the Zoom gods are cooperating. I will share my screen. And the talk today has been labeled as a conversation about public space and spatial justice. And I want to say that it could also, keeping in mind this idea of these acknowledgements and sort of just everything that we're looking at and facing today, that could really also be titled the conversations at the intersection of healing and design. And so for me, you know, to start with that, I want to really particularly focus on this idea of healing, because I think it can mean many things. And it's a way that has been part of my work increasingly in the last few years. And I know in this time of the pandemic, it feels particularly complicated, and also in a time where our country is particularly bitterly divided. There are a lot of examples of harm and suffering constantly filling our social media feeds. But I want to acknowledge that, like, healing at its heart is really this idea, at least when I think about design, I look at the instrument of spatial justice. And, you know, for me, spatial justice becomes a tool to start to achieve healing in the environments in which we call home, in which we work, in which we play. Now, I recognize that spatial justice might not be a term that is familiar to everyone, so allow me to define it. It basically is a word that was coined by geographers, and it means that justice has a geography, and that the equitable distribution of access, services, and outcomes should be a basic human right. And, you know, because I'm a visual person, I think it's important to, like, offer visual examples of this. And we see it in neighborhoods and in cities across the country. And the reality is we don't have spatial justice when it's possible to see differences in which neighborhoods got the industrial uses and not the gleaming office towers, or which neighborhoods got the insufficient bus routes versus those that got the multi-million-dollar transit centers, or which neighborhoods have the harmful and decaying infrastructure versus the ones that get the cutting edge technologies, or even which neighborhoods is there a proliferation of vacant lots versus which ones you know, actually have a plethora of nice parks. All of these are examples of what the lack of spatial justice looks like. And we can't talk about injustice in space without also talking about injustice across race and class, because the truth of the matter is that Indigenous, Black, Brown, and poor communities have disproportionately had less access, and that has been no accident. And I introduced the connection between these things because I think it's important to note that as long as we are separated and selectively harmed by space, we're not going to achieve any of the other justices we seek. We're not going to be able to get to whatever a healed future might be. And so as I talk about this as a frame, I want you to hold that. And I have been using spatial justice as a lens in my work for many, many years. And so in the spirit of offering more visual examples, I'm going to share two stories from my projects that illustrate a little bit of what spatial justice looks like. So the first one is located here, local to me in San Francisco, on the site of a former power plant that's located in the historic working class African-American neighborhood of Bayview Hunters Point. And so that neighborhood is really an example of what the lack of spatial justice looks like. So it has, among other things, one of the highest concentrations of public housing in the city, and as well as the highest concentration of industrial uses in the city. And pre-pandemic, this is a city where the median home price was actually over $1 million, but the median income in this neighborhood was a little over $60,000. So you can already begin to see some of the pretty significant disparities that exist here. So this power plant that you see actually existed for almost a century. And then in the late 90s, a group of mothers who lived in the public housing on this hill above the plant actually led a community coalition to fight for its closure. They were successful. A utility company closed down the plant, cleaned the soil, and capped it with asphalt so that the clean soil wouldn't blow away. The challenge with this is that because of various things like land entitlements, lease agreements, et cetera, it was actually going to be, at that point, conceived about a decade before anything could be done here. We are at that decade mark, so it is going to be more like 2 decades before anything can be done here. And the problem with that is that the land, when they finished that cleanup process, actually looked like this: 30 acres of asphalt. So you can imagine what it might mean to have 30 acres of asphalt right in your backyard that's just vacant. And so the utility company, to their credit, actually recognized that it's going to be untenable to leave the land vacant for this long. And so they sought alternatives of what could happen in the site. On the site in the interim. And so they put out a call for design teams to propose interim activations for the site. And I'm part of a team that won that commission. And so for the past 7 or 8 years, this collective of the utility company, my design team, local organizations and residents have been working to transform this site from a place that has been forbidden and even had these sort of negative histories associated with it to one that could be loved and of benefit to the community. So that collaboration has created a range of programming, everything from job training workshops and an annual circus that pre-COVID collectively over the last few years has brought 25,000 people to the site, or more than that number actually. And then in the time of COVID, because clearly we could not bring people together in the same way, we've actually been leveraging our resources to try to create amenities that actually would be of service to the community. And I think this is important because, you know, in our ultimate horizon, it may be about how do we make the transformation of the site be one that centers community benefit. But we have to understand that the path to get there means being in right relationship with the community. And I would say that in a traditional design project, we might at this point pause our work, right? Or go into a more internal process until the circumstances allowed us to be able to do, you know, these fun little things like that we were doing before. But if we're actually talking about what it means to be in right relationship and actually looking at all of our work from a relational mindset, it means that understanding that we actually never stop working to leverage our resources, and I would say as well our privilege, in support of those who are most in need. And so in 2020 and still now today in 2021, that has meant working in collaboration with local groups to figure out what were the key needs that we could use our ability to help deliver. And so one of the things we heard very early on was a huge need around food access. So, you know, we hustled. We formed a partnership with the San Francisco Produce Market, and this year it's with the food bank. We've given, since April, we've given over 5,000 bags or boxes of food. We also have hustled wherever we can to get additional resources. So we've given away masks, we've given away art kits for kids. Now the Department of Public Health is even using our site for COVID testing. Pre-COVID, there was also a small permanent piece of the project that was able to move forward about 2 years ago, in which we created a beautiful shoreline park on the edge of the site, because that still needed to be remediated. So rather than restoring it to just a piece of dirt, we actually restored it to a higher level. And the various events you saw on the previous page, they actually were like our community meeting. So instead of saying show up to a hall and talk about a project that you're not going to see for years, and it's probably going to look different by the time you see it, we actually said, well, come to this event where we're offering something that is of benefit to you. And while you're there, we'll engage you in a conversation about what you want to see. And so the conversations that we had there really drove the design of this, and both the site and the events that I shared, they really have grown over the years to become quite beloved by the community, and were really viewed as a community resource. The second project that I wanted to show is all the way across on the other side of the country. And it's on an 11-acre site in Charlottesville, Virginia, that for 40 years has been home to 150 families that are living in Section 8 units. I'm part of a team that has been working on this for years, and we're basically redeveloping the property, transforming it into a mixed income neighborhood of 450 homes. And now I know when many of you think of Charlottesville, you likely think of the events of 2017, the white supremacist incursion and the killing of Heather Heyer. And our process actually started well before those tragic events, but it cannot be ignored that it is part of our context. And I mean that literally. So this street that you're looking at is actually, this is a picture from fall 2017. This is a street where Heather Heyer was killed. And if you were to go 2 blocks south, like literally where a little bit behind where you see this car, that's where you would find Friendship Court, the project I just showed on the previous slide. So, you know, this context of those events and what it means to talk about Charlottesville in this way are explicitly wrapped up into how we think about what we are doing. Our work has really been driven by how do we give those who have been kind of harmed in the past, and the residents really, the ability to define the terms and conditions of what do we do to move forward? What does a healed future look like? So from the beginning of the project, we actually established a project advisory committee, which you see here is made up, pictured as everybody, but it's 9 elected residents, 1 former resident who's also a community leader, and a couple members of the community that had been appointed based on specific knowledge that they could bring to the project. And they basically have been empowered as co-decision makers alongside the nonprofit that owns the site. So literally every major decision of the project is run by them, and they have final say on it. We've also deployed really interactive forms of engagement to try to reach other residents to make sure that they're in the know and that we're also registering their preferences. And then this property, the population is actually 50% youth. So it has been a really important thing since early in the project to make sure we're engaging the youth because they are part of that population that needs to be centered. And so that's what that's looked like. It's a number of different things, including workshops with the kids. We partnered with UVA to go after a grant to actually set up a youth leadership program. And the youth in that program, basically it became a platform for us to do like a really deep dive. In a way, it was like a youth advisory committee. We also worked with them to identify some quick wins that we could do on site. So one of the things that's really important to me in any project is knowing that ultimate development is usually several years down the road. How do we create things that allow us to prototype ideas, but also allow people to get a kind of physical taste of change sooner? And so we worked with the kids to identify a couple of those things and start to build them out. And then I think lastly, connected with the youth program, one of the important things was also just to give them different skills and experiences. For some of these kids, UVA is barely a mile or 2 away from this property. When I first started working on the project, none of these kids had ever stepped foot on that campus. And even among some of the adults, they still sort of in an offhand way referred to UVA as the plantation. So there clearly was a gulf. And so one of the things that's been really great is, you know, I co-taught a course at UVA where the kids were essentially the clients and working in partnership with the students. And for many of them, it was the first time there. It was the first time some of them had even thought of this idea of design as something that they could do. And we actually identified one kid who was brilliant, and he's actually now part of our advisory committee. So this idea of creating opportunities to engage people in different ways, I think is a really key part of what does it mean to move towards spatial justice. So where we ended up with all of that is this plan for a multi-year, multi-phased redevelopment. Another core tenet of the way in which we're working is that there is going to be 0 displacement. So we're actually doing the first development right now. This is what you see here. This is actually all just green space. So all the development can happen here, and then we can start to move people over and demolish units. So we're going to do that kind of staggered redevelopment. The core of the property is what will eventually be a city park. And that will also feature a community garden. And we're also developing things like our early childhood center. So in many ways, it's like, how do we create this really better place to live that, you know, ideally would give people different opportunities. But I think that, you know, sort of therein lies the catch. So I think anyone who's a sort of architect or designer who's used to presenting projects knows that I could probably just stop here and bask in the glow of these super inspiring stories and really deeply community engaged processes. And, you know, I think the reality is that if I did that, I would actually just be leaving you with incomplete stories and this in no way negates what has been accomplished at either of these sites. The reality is that if we only see the fulfillment of spatial justice being the output of high quality spaces, then we're kind of missing the mark. We will, as my client and collaborator, Sunshine Mathone, who's executive director of Piedmont Housing Alliance, the owner of Friendship Court, you know, if that's all that we do, we're basically just going to be helping the poor be poor better. That's the equivalent of putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. And I don't know, I know for me, that doesn't sit well as a destination, and I don't think it should for any of us. So what that means is, like, if we really wanted to see the full extent of the wound that we really need to heal, that we need to leverage the instrument of spatial justice towards, it means in Charlottesville that we would acknowledge that 2017 actually was not the beginning. We could go as far back as slavery, or even just to the 1960s, when urban renewal came to a town as small as Charlottesville and led to the raising of vibrant Black neighborhoods and the creation of concentrated zones of racialized poverty, such as Friendship Court. We could also see that these wounds, if we were really to take the expansiveness of them in Bayview Hunters Point, it would mean recognizing that just because we've been able to create joy, particularly Black joy, does not mean that there hasn't also been loss, particularly Black loss. San Francisco had one of the highest Black populations in the Western United States for almost a century. And in this neighborhood of Bayview Hunters Point was a beacon for that. Now it's ground zero for gentrification, and it's a beacon for the decimation of the Black population in the city. Seeing these wounds means understanding that unless we are holding space for acknowledging and reckoning with the stories of harm and benefit that shape the context that we're working in, and unless we commit to never assuming that a project starts at point zero, these inspiring images that I've just shown you will merely exist as disconnected moments of feeling good instead of catalytic and sustained efforts to heal. So that word healing again, this question of what do we mean, what does it mean to heal, I think really requires that we take this broader lens. So it's not as simple as deploying these instruments of design that we're used to, like a building or a park. It actually requires a broader frame of seeing what we're really looking at. And so for me, what comes to mind is a quote that I shared in my TED Talk a couple of years ago. And it was that we often rush to remake, thinking that we can erase the pain of these places. But in our boundless desire to do good, to get past the mistakes, to create places to hold new possibilities, we often maintain a blissful ignorance about a landscape filled with a long trail of broken promises and squelched dreams. We are building on top of brokenness. I followed that line with this question: is it any wonder that the foundations cannot hold? So as I reflect on where we might go with this conversation, I want to note that how we hold healing in this moment is also a question of how we hold the brokenness. And perhaps more specifically, what is the context of that brokenness? For much of the past year, I've been talking about how it seems like we're locked in a cycle where we only know two states of time: the time of urgency, or rather emergency, and the time of complacency. In a time of urgency, we're eager for solutions that erase the pain of seeing and knowing. And I feel like it's important here to also be clear that I think that there's actually two types of urgency, that which is focused on repair. And so I think when you hear people say the fierce urgency of now, that's often the type of urgency that they're referring to. And then there's the urgency which is focused on forgetting. And I actually believe that that latter urgency, the tendency to want to forget, is what exists within the frame of the systems of oppression and it's often the one that dominates. And in that type of urgency, when we feel like we've done enough, when we're able to get to the point where we can forget the pain and discomfort, we shift into a time of complacency, which essentially is a return to quote unquote normal, which for far too many is basically business as usual with a better Band-Aid. But here's the thing, to lean into any state of normal is to choose willful ignorance or to accept that collateral harm is sad, but inevitable. And I don't understand how that could be a satisfactory solution to any of us. So I want us to hold that the path to healing can't be found if we're moving so fast and blindly in our urgency that we can't fully sit with the discomfort that we and our systems have wrought, or so obliviously in our complacency that the discomfort becomes invisible to those with enough privilege to see past it. And so for me, that often brings to mind this frame, which is also something else that I've been talking about a lot this year. And I mean it a little bit tongue in cheek, but I'm actually quite serious. So I don't mean apocalypse within the sci-fi terminology. I actually mean it from something from our past. The word apocalypse is actually a derivative of the Greek word that means an uncovering or an unveiling. And it's been for many of us a year since COVID became our reality, since many of us locked down. And I think that when that first announcement came about the lockdown, it was cataclysmic. And for many, it ushered in a time in which we struggled to find stable ground. But it's important to recognize that for many others, ground has long been uncertain. Millions living at the precipice of housing and food insecurity, neighborhoods of color having significantly greater vulnerability to poor health outcomes and early death, Black men and women, myself included, knowing that occupying public space safely is far from a universal right. None of these are new phenomena. What has changed is that the world suddenly got quiet enough for so many more of us to listen, to see, and to feel. We have all been allowed to really take stock of the power and the trauma of these systems that are working exactly as designed. Let me repeat that. The systems are working exactly as designed. So when it comes to both of the projects that I shared, or any of the places in which you might be working in, or the products that you might be working on, that the systems are working as designed, that has to be our starting point. So when I talk about healing and design, I'm talking about being just as intentional about acknowledging, reckoning, and healing the systems of harm in our built environment as we have been complicit in supporting their existence. For me, to hold healing essential to what I do is in particular about the concept of care. I don't just see myself as a designer. I understand that I am someone who helps shape the built environment, then I am one of the caretakers of that environment. And to be a caretaker means to have a responsibility to everything and everyone within it, to the many stories that are impacted by my actions. And to be accountable to that way of practice and being requires that I be in relationship, deep relationship, with the communities that are the ultimate stewards of the places that I work in. So what does that look like on the ground? Well, let's go back to those two projects that I shared. In Bayview Hunters Point, my team and I have been holding care by remembering that to shift from a place of harm to one of healing does not occur overnight or simply as the result of something beautiful rising from the ground. Instead, there needs to be a form of reckoning that intersects with the design process. So in this project, that reckoning is happening on multiple levels. And there's a place where it's happening in this active state. And that's through these ongoing conversations around pain and resilience that we have in the project. So that includes everything from an early partnership that we did at the very beginning with StoryCorps to record stories of those who've been active in the fight to close down the plant. And we then held listening parties in which we shared those stories out and used that as a foundation to have a conversation about what people wanted to see. And then more recently, right before the pandemic, actually, we did a year-long partnership with the artist Chris Johnson, who had conceived of the Question Bridge Black Male exhibit. And we used the Question Bridge format to actually say, how do we have a conversation about race and place? And so we invited any attendee to our events to participate in that conversation, such as you see here. And then we also had a day-long symposium, which ended with staging the Question Bridge Black Males exhibit, which actually included several men from this neighborhood, but had, while this thing exists in many illustrious museum collections around the world, had never actually been shown in this neighborhood. And so we used it, the showing of it as this catalyst to continue the conversation. Knowing that the Bayview was changing, we weren't looking at our events to sort of be like, but here's a place you can come and you see people of color and you see the things that remind you of the richness of the neighborhood. We basically said, we want to jump in to like, what does it mean to change? And in particular, we had a number of artists who participated in panels where we had a conversation of what does it mean to be placemakers, knowing we may be creating the very thing that is bringing new people and pushing out old people. Like, how do we hold the tension within that? And how do we have conversations about being intentional and deliberate with our work, that we are counteracting that as much as possible? And how do we leave space to hear any expressions of anger or pain that sit around that? And so to sort of say, we're not trying to get to a resolution today, we're just trying to hold space for this conversation to be held. The reckoning also does take place on permanent pieces. So going back to the shoreline image, I didn't really talk that much about it, but these two things are examples of interpretive signage that we have all throughout the shoreline that really respond to one of the things that we heard from the very beginning in our conversations within the community, was this fear that stories were being lost as the neighborhood was changing and people were dying or moving off. And they wanted people to know what had happened there. So we have stories that tell various histories of the neighborhood. This particular one that you see is telling the history of the power plant and including the struggle to fight for its closure. The StoryCorps recordings that I mentioned in the previous slide, we've taken quotes from people and it's put in permanent in the landscape all throughout. So the idea is you're never not going to see or confront the story of what made this place what it is. At Friendship Court, the team and I have been finding care by expanding the design process to support opportunities for repair that look beyond just only producing built form like housing or a park, and instead look to the active dreaming and practicing of new ways to heal and move past the yoke of systemic oppression. We've steadily been moving towards the articulation of these spatial justice pillars that you see. And then using redevelopment not as the destination of where we're trying to get to, but rather the lever that could catalyze change. And I think within that, we've also found that it's important to understand that if you look at it, the lever, the thing that must always be centered are the people who are going to be most impacted by what you create, and that they should be the ones who are responsible for determining the terms and conditions of a healed future. And when we did this, what we got is these pillars that you see: generational health, shared power, healing and well-being, cultural belonging, empathy, were really derived from the conversations with the residents. And the idea is that those are the pillars of what a reparative community might look like. And I offer them up here to sort of say, I think we often race to looking at just, what do we need to be able to get to this? What do we need to do to be able to get to design? And I think when you hold, what do you need to be able to get to conditions of repair, that you identify what are your core principles of development in a very different way. And just to take that a step further and show an example of what's happened with one of those pillars. So that means that the development of a city park and a community garden isn't just about doing a community engaged process to determine where the plants go or what the form looks like, but constantly maintaining sight of a horizon line that articulates and frames opportunities and interconnected forces and partners that should be held as central to what we do. And that center then allows us to understand what is the foundation of repair. So as we move forward, we're not just holding the bricks and sticks, we're holding, this is where we need to get to, and who needs to be at the table to support that? How does that filter into the design? And how do we start to shape different agendas and programs and even fundraising to create this ecosystem? Because this doesn't work unless we do all of this. So, I would say inclusion, I think that in this moment of revelation, I'm inviting you to lean into not forgetting that there's harm, or that for too long our work has actually often ended up doing more to contribute to it than to alleviate it. And I'm inviting you to think about what it might mean if we all saw ourselves as healers, caretakers of the built environment, which is more broadly defined as being about remembering, reckoning, and repairing. The great abolitionist Miriam Kaba has said that hope is a discipline. And I would argue that this larger process of healing is one too. And so I think as part of how do we create a sort of intentional practice around it, for me, there are kind of a couple of prompts that often come to mind. The first is, are we holding space to acknowledge that harm has been done here? And by that, I don't just mean conversations, although the conversations are important. I do think that this is a place where you can think about design as an instrument for that as well. So you think about what I showed in Bayview Hunters Point with some of those events. Those events were specifically, and the ways we organize the space were specifically designed around being opportunities to acknowledge the harm and sit in conversation around that. The second prompt I would offer is, are we reckoning with who was harmed and how, and with who benefited and how? If you think back to those examples, visual examples I showed of what the lack of spatial justice looked like, it's not just about the condition that existed in the place that had the lack. It's also about the conditions that exist in the places that have something. And if we're actually going to get to a place where we remedy, we have to, part of the acknowledgement and part of the reckoning sits within that. And I think that moving forward in a way that is not, just paving over and on top of brokenness, relies on us sort of saying, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to set forth the conditions where that can't happen again? And then the final prompt I would have is, are we letting the terms and conditions of repair to be determined by those most harmed in the past? And are we viewing acts of repair through the long arc of healing time? So let me break that up just a little bit, because I know it's a lot. If you see in the projects, and I would say, if you take a traditional project, the folks who determine the conditions of repair often are the people who have the power and privilege in a situation. That's the way that our traditional processes work. And I think to actually say we're going to remedy what has been done, we need to actually create space at the table for those who have been harmed. I often say that I have two clients, the people who pay me and the people who have to live with what I've created. And I think our process honors the first and not the second. And so if we don't let that second actually determine what repair looks like, then we're essentially replicating the system of harm, just in a way that makes us feel better about it. So I think it's really important that we say, how do we let those people set that tone and understand that when it works for them, it works for all of us. And then the healing time reference is really to sort of say, no project, no thing we ever do is about the here and now, the conditions we see right before us in this present moment. It is always about what has happened before and where we're trying to get to in the future. And so I don't think we can understand repair and healing in any other context unless we take a look at both what does that past look like and what is the future we want to get to. So that's the work. I'm looking forward to being in conversation with you about it. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Well, we have a lot of questions that have come in, and some that have come in previous as well to this event. So I'm trying to group things a little bit here because some people have similar questions to one another. So I'll try to group those things a little bit together into one question, and maybe I'll do a little bit of follow up with you, Liz, to get more at the finer points of some of the questions that have come in. But we did get a lot of questions around sort of race, space, and memorialization, and kind of how those things intertwine. So I kind of wanted to lead off with the question that somebody asked here, which is how might we imagine moving forward with reckoning projects that address Portland's history of systemic racism, including park names and other kinds of things like that, in ways that might set an example for other communities across the US?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's not just a Portland question. It's a question that every community is having. I can tell you in all the many different cities that I work in, that is at the heart of what we're looking at. And I think that those last points that I raised really speak to that. So the first question you want to answer to be able to get at that is, what is the harm that's been done? Like, we often rush to the problem solving part without actually leaving space to articulate what exactly is the problem, what exactly is the condition that we're trying to repair. And I would argue that oftentimes if we say, oh, we know what we're fixing, the definition of what we're fixing has often been laid forth by people who are in positions of power and privilege. And what I tried to articulate in my talk is like, those actually aren't the people you're supposed to be asking or that you're supposed to be relying on to give the sole definition of what needs to be repaired. So I think that it's really important that there's a process that's built around like daylighting all of that stuff. And when I say centering those who've been most harmed, I'm also not doing that at the exclusion of all the other actors. I'm sort of just saying that, like, let's get to those whose stories are always the ones who are unseen or undervalued. And then through that, use it as an opportunity to have a conversation with the other groups. And I think that in the process of moving forward, once you allow an understanding of what the harm has been, then you start to have like these really tough questions of what does reckoning look like? I can't actually give you an answer of what reckoning look like, because I think it actually is very context specific, and it actually emanates from understanding what the harm has been. And I think it's not an easy conversation, nor is it a fast conversation. And there will often be 2 steps back for every step forward. But I think there's like kind of a steady march of a movement forward that needs to happen. So, in the Bayview, if you watch my TED Talk, you'll hear a sort of deeper story of that project. And you'll hear about the fact that there was actually, a community meeting we held pretty far along in the project when we had done a lot of that great stuff. And it was held in large part by the utility company, who was ready to start talking about what does long-term development look like. And that was an absolute disaster, in part because there hadn't been a long enough space of creating opportunities for this conversation of actually acknowledging the harm and reckoning with it. We kind of went from that initial story core straight to like these amazing solutions, and that just rubbed people the wrong way. And I imagine now, if you were to come back into this community, and I'm part of another project next door to the one that I showed, where there's actually a city park that's being redeveloped. We're actually developing an equity development plan alongside, similar to the 11th Street Bridge Park in DC, alongside the development, as a way to kind of hold accountability for not just that there's a rectifying of park inequity here, but accountability to what are the other things within the ecosystem that are required. But that could only have come by leaving this like long trajectory of conversations to occur.
Thank you. I'll just follow up really quickly with a question that sort of dives a little bit deeper into trying to understand sort of where the democratic process comes into the memorialization process around racial healing specifically. And somebody asked here, in Portland and elsewhere, monuments have been toppled by mobs and vandals. More recently, a monument on Mount Tabor was secretly replaced in the dark of night, which city officials did not condemn because they agreed with the politics of it. Regardless of political agenda, is this exclusionary? Does it violate our democratic norms for process and public engagement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a complicated question and maybe one that's already baking in a perspective, but you know, I think one of the things to recognize, well, I would say two things. So one, there's a brilliant poet, Nayyirah Waheed, who says that anger is grief that has been silent for too long. So I would say sometimes there's often this desire to clap back at expressions of anger. And I would just sort of caution all of us to kind of say, you know, what you are seeing and witnessing is kind of a form of public grief. And so sit with that. Like, what would you do if you saw people grieving? And what is your response around that? The other thing that I would say is, you know, I take issue a little bit with the use of the word democratic, because I think we can't use that word without acknowledging that democracy has actually often been subservient to white supremacy for much of our country's history. Like, the norms and conditions that we accept as democratic often have a baked in power structure as to who gets to say what, when. And so to that point that we're not starting at point zero, I think this question of like, who gets to determine what happens has to also hold like, well, who has historically determined what has happened and who has historically not been a part of that conversation? And that what we're actually looking is not to say, let's give everybody equal voice, right? Because that's not actually the point that we're in yet. We need to like first reckon with the fact that the voices have been unequal, and what does it take to actually get to some point of rectification? That's not to say that there's not going to be harm and there's not going to be mistakes and there's not going to be places where you do something and then you actually realize that you have to move it a little bit further back. I think that really the thing is to admit when something is not working or when something went awry, and then ask, well, what are we going to do about this now? And how do we like actually not just look at this immediate action of the monuments being toppled, but look at the longer arc of like, well, how did we get to the point where the monument was toppled? Because I think oftentimes our conversations start at the toppling of the monuments and not this larger frame. And what I was trying to articulate through my talk is that until you do this, it's actually hard to talk about what do we do to move forward.
That actually kind of leads a little bit perfectly into a question that came in a little bit later that connects to this, and you're kind of already touching on that. So maybe you can say a little bit more about it. But the question that came in was, shouldn't we hold space for healing and take the time needed well in advance of placemaking, project planning and implementation, or can it be done in parallel?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that I actually think that they can roughly be done in parallel. Like, I think there is some gosh, total end of the day brain fog. There's a virtue to like having space for conversation first. But I think where you're trying to get that conversation space to is not a resolution, but to like articulate what is the next lily pad that you need to jump from. So for example, in the case of the Bayview Hunters Point project, the very first thing we did was we went out into the community and we had conversations, one-on-one, two-on-one conversations with folks who had been involved in the fight to close the power plant. And we did that in many ways because I was like, I can't even go and draft what a community meeting might look like until I hear their stories and their position. And it was out of those early conversations that we heard two things that became really important for what we did next. We heard that people really felt that those stories were being lost because people were leaving the Bayview, and that no one was going to ever know the amazing things that had happened there because to everyone on the outside, it was thought of as the ghetto, right? And then we had also heard, because this neighborhood is heavily overplanned when we first started working there. There've been 20 years of plans and planning processes to develop sites around the neighborhood that often never got past the planning stage. And so the community was planned out. And so us coming to say, hey, we have this great idea of things we want to do here. To them, they were like, yeah, right, whatever. I'll believe you when I see something. And so we then partnered with StoryCorps to build the listening booth, to sort of say, with this partnership with StoryCorps had a permanent booth in San Francisco, but very few stories had been recorded from this neighborhood. And so we partnered with their community recording program to put this booth here. And that was our way of sort of saying, we heard you. Like you said, stories weren't being lost. So now stories recorded in this, every story is going to be archived in the Library of Congress. You also get your CD to take it with you. If you're African American, it also goes in the Museum of African American History. So your story will never be lost. And then the listening parties became a way for us to also hear those stories. And so the response we heard from community members was, you listened to us, you heard us. And that allowed us to get to the next step of like, okay, let's talk about what are some ideas for events or things that we can do here. And so that booth was not the project, right? That booth was a step to allow us to do the thing. And so I often describe my approach to design as a little bit like a call and response. Like I'm in conversation with the community, and any design effort I do is basically a kind of visual and spatial response, excuse me, to something that I've heard. So that idea of designing through prototyping, designing through experience is something that I think does go hand in hand with this process of listening. It's a way to test out ideas. It's a way to show people that you heard what they said. And it's a way to like advance a process of development while also having space for conversation.
I want to change course here just a little bit in what we're talking about. It's all very central, but a little bit different approach here on some questions that people are having around sort of the power sharing and the power dynamics between the communities and the elected officials or the developers or that often engage in spatial development projects. And the justice that and considerations around race that are involved in that, and issues of trust as well in that regard. So I just have some questions here that I think kind of form a logical line of thinking that we can follow. But to bring it into one of the examples that you had in your slide presentation, one person asked, what were the foundations that led elected officials to share power with residents in the Virginia example?
Yeah, so the power sharing actually was around the property owner, right? Because they're the ones who are actually explicitly controlling what happens in a lot of the lead decision making of what happens with that property. And I would say a lot of it was just like they wanted to do the right thing. They're a nonprofit, and they're committed to doing right by their residents. And I would say, a lot of the projects that I end up working on, which I don't think by any means are like unicorns, right? I definitely take riskier projects, but I think the sentiments that I see within them are pretty consistent that I've seen throughout, is that people generally desire to do the right thing. It's just in the positions that they have, they rarely can see how to do it. And so my work often becomes like, well, how do we allow that desire to actually meet the opportunity? So in this case, it's like, they were really committed to zero displacement, in part because they recognize the long history within Charlottesville. And as a nonprofit committed to housing, they wanted to figure out how to do the best housing that they possibly could do. But they also knew that they were existing in a housing development process that actually rewards not doing that right thing. It rewards just doing good enough. And so they basically had this conundrum of, how do I meet the things I need to do to get this project funded with like doing the right thing. So the efforts around the advisory committee were really built around, well, part of the way in which you do that is you need to hear from the people who are impacted. And so that advisory committee was like sort of the first step within that. And then the other thing that we had to do, and I definitely, we had the whole like take a step forward, then get hit 2 steps back, is it actually ended up slowing down the design process pretty significantly from what normally happens. And I think an important part of that was we had to slow it down kind of to operate at the speed of trust and to operate at the speed of understanding. And one of the things that I do in a lot of my projects, you know, just like I said, building the StoryCorps booth was important to allow people to feel like we had actually heard them. I think in any sort of trust building conversation, and this operates on both sides, both the side of residents, and at the side of property owners, is that you have to create ways for people to see at a very small level, what does a win look like and feel like, to give them confidence to stick with you enough to make it to the next lily pad. And so in the Charlottesville project, some of it was just hearing from the residents what actually was like, you know, once we set up this advisory committee, it gave a window to hear from residents in a really different way that I think it allowed the nonprofit to see and hear things that they had not heard before in the past, right? Like none of their previous engagement efforts had ever led them to hear certain things. And yet they could understand, oh, this is key to our success. And so that allowed them to stick with the process a little bit more. Or even in the space of, and maybe this speaks specifically around the city part. So a member of the advisory committee we've always had one city council member as part of that advisory committee, in part so that they're hearing what's happening all alongside and that they can report that back to the city. And I remember one of the very first set of conversations that we did with the advisory committee wasn't so much present what we want to do or tell us all the things that are wrong with the project. They were actually just like dinners that were meet and greets with all the members of the advisory committee. And I remember it was probably like the third one, the city council woman came up to me afterwards and said, you know, it's amazing. I sat down next to this resident and we just, you know, started talking, and we discovered that both of our children were autistic. And in discussing the trials and tribulations we were negotiating around that, it ended up becoming a bonding experience for us. But also, I got a credible insight to, like, I know the resources I have as a like middle-class woman, and I'm seeing what she's doing with the resources that she has. And it just gave me a completely different insight to resident life that I had not seen before. And that city council person actually now is retired. She's no longer on the city council. She's still part of our advisory committee and is like one of the biggest supporters for the project and one of the people that the residents trust the most to kind of get that outside perspective. And I'm not saying that dinner and that conversation hammered it home, but getting people to see each other not as adversaries, not within their positional roles, but like as human beings who are trying to get through things the best they can is actually really important. And I think sometimes our processes are set around heavily transactional things as opposed to like, what does it take to be in relation with one another? And so I think, yeah, long-winded way of saying that I think some of this is like really about like, and I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish about it at all, but I do think it's important to talk about how are we building relationships, and that you can't actually push for change. Change is like risky. Everybody fears change. I don't care like how risk averse you are. And we can't build comfort with that unless we build conditions of trust. And you can't build conditions of trust unless you get people to connect as human beings.
That really speaks to a couple of the other sort of finer pointed questions, and maybe we can ask you to kind of explore that territory a little bit more around trust and bridging the gap of trust as well. So I'm going to kind of connect two questions here. So the first is essentially, why should Black and Brown people, or those most marginalized historically, trust the appeals for healing, truth, and reconciliation from white savior planning projects? And so basically the idea here is many olive branches have been extended, only resulting in further benefit for white supremacist institutions and structures and systems. And sort of following up on that, then how do you bridge this gap where the one who pays you may not wish to take all of the steps necessary to heal?
Yeah, okay, those are both very good, very hard questions. So yeah, the first one is, I would say, yeah, like you have every reason not to trust the process. And I think one of the things that I often say to community members in that, who represent those communities, is that this is, I want to pause for a moment of sort of saying, that other person who's coming at you, and just sort of say for you that you're existing in a place where your needs are often not seen, right? Like I said in the beginning, there's a place where stories are undervalued and bodies are not cherished. And that's real. And there's a lot of pain with that. And so above all else, regardless of what's connected to a project, I want folks in those communities, and many of them have often been doing it, but then sometimes there's also places where there may be a desire but no time, is to start to have a conversation of what does your own healing look like, and what are the terms and conditions you want to demand that are given as part of these efforts. And so it's not to sort of say, give everything to them, like, yes, welcome them in, they want to do right by you. Like, frankly, their job should always be understanding that they are in a trust deficit, and that their work needs to be constant in healing that deficit. It's not on you to sort of go and bail them out and sort of say, yes, of course, come in and do this project. But I don't want to disconnect that from this idea that, like, there is healing for people who look like me to do. And that part of my call for power, and part of what drives me in my work as someone of privilege who gets hired to work on these projects, is like, what does our own healing look like? And how do we give voice to that? Because I think unless we do that, they'll run roughshod over us. And so it's really important that we take ownership of the process. Then, and now I'm going to need you to repeat that second part of the question.
Oh no, you've actually gone a long way to answering that question, but I'll just say it again here. How do you bridge the gap between your two clients, where the one who pays you may not wish to take all the steps necessary to healing? You really kind of encapsulated the answer to that quite nicely. But if you want to say something more.
Yeah, I guess the second thing that I would say within that is, as it relates to that particular part of the client relationship, is no one benefits from white supremacy. Like, everyone is scarred by it. Even white people, even people in power. Like, there are no winners in this situation. And so part of my work is to understand, okay, you who have hired me for this project, like, you're also pained by these conditions in one way or another, even if you don't necessarily realize it, although most of the people who come to hire me, they're at the point where they at least have some recognition. And so part of this is also like supporting your ability to do the right thing as opposed to doing the good thing. And so just as I spend time getting to know the community client, sitting in their home, sitting in conversations with them, I'm actually doing the same thing on the other end. Because I recognize that as a consultant, I ultimately leave the building, literally and figuratively. And my role has to be, in part, how am I building a relationship between these two pieces? And part of building that relationship is getting the paying client ready to be in a proper, right, trustful relationship with the community client. And so I actually spend a lot of time getting to know my paying clients, getting to be, build a relationship with them that is also with trust. Because oftentimes, if I'm advocating for something that's particularly for the community that may cause a little bit of heartache on this other side, I have to get them to trust that I have their best interests at heart as well, right? Like, I think really part of this is not necessarily I'm only looking at one group and everybody else be damned. I'm operating of a framework of best for all, right? But I understand that for it to really work for all, it has to center those who are harmed. But I'm also holding space for those other people who exist on that sort of ecosystem. And so the thing, I often joke that like, I may get hired for one particular job description, but by the end of the day, my role almost becomes a quasi-conciliary to everyone on the project, because I need them to trust me, and I need them to trust them that I'll tell them the truth no matter what. So like, I totally have fights with both sets of clients, when I say things that are hard to hear, but I think that that's important for them to trust that like, I'm not just telling them what I need to tell them to be able to get one over them, right? Like, it may not be what they like, but it's what I believe. And I will also say that I have walked from projects. Like, if we reach a point where the client who pays is, not doing right in a way that I believe in, and I feel like we've lost a trustful relationship, I'm not afraid to sort of say, okay, I'll set things up to try and support the community the best I can, but I can no longer be part of the project in this way. And I would say that I think that's something that I don't know as designers that we do as much as we could. I think we often operate in we're in a service industry, and we're responding to a commission the best that we can, and we have limited power. And I actually, I call bullshit on that. I think that like complicity is an important thing. And if you are going to be not just an ally, which is a word we use a lot, but if you're going to be an accomplice for these things, then like you need to be able to risk something. And in my, I'm risking being yelled at. I'm risking telling people the truth, even if they don't want to hear it. And I'm risking that, like, sometimes it's not worth whatever I'm getting paid, whatever might come with the project is not worth it if the project is doing wrong by a community or by the values that we've set forth in the project.
You've actually, in the course of this, answered a couple other questions, but I just want to kind of pose them. You don't have to answer them because I think you've gone quite a long ways already. But I just wanted to let people know that sort of there was these outstanding other questions out there to kind of frame what you just said. The two questions that I kind of have in mind here are who should lead the process of daylighting the power imbalances, read systemic racism, classism, when those who benefit from maintaining the dominant paradigm are likely the ones who are paying for the process. I think you've said a lot in terms of your own role in doing that and helping to highlight the agency that the people, the communities that you're working with also have in sort of charting their own course and creating their own destinies there, and your sort of role in that as well. And the other piece about raising awareness and educating those who hold power as a first step, whether that should happen or whether or not there should be more of a centering those who've been harmed when working on a project, and sort of which happens first. Does the centering happen first, or the sort of advanced work of educating those in power happen first?
I will say on that last one, I think they're a little bit simultaneous, although I'd almost say there's a little bit of an education piece that might occur with those in power initially to set up some of the initial terms and conditions, right, to be able to then go and identify those who've been harmed. Because if those in power are not on board at some level in the beginning, you're not actually going to be able to accomplish anything of the things that you want to accomplish. And so it's actually, there's like a certain level of buy-in that needs to be developed that sets up the infrastructure for accountability. And I think that's like a huge, I haven't really used that word as much, but I think that that's a huge thing when we talk about positions of power. Really, it's like, how are we setting up the conditions that those who have had power in the past can be held accountable? And if you don't have an accountability measure, that's where you wind up in the like kind of doing good versus doing right setup.
Yeah, and just before we pivot a little bit towards a different subject matter, I thought, especially based on what you just said, I think there's an interesting question that came in excuse me, around the idea of not like, you know, not wanting to do well and not wanting to do the right thing, but when you exist in a sort of structure or bureaucracy that is a little unforgiving or potentially inflexible or siloed or you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so one person asked here, municipal projects often seem to be more about keeping up with repairs and with doing things, in quotes, the way we've always done them. In other words, the bureaucracy is not necessarily flexible enough to allow for the kind of innovation you've presented. Do you have any suggestions for how this, to get city departments to take these types of ideas more seriously?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is a little bit of an active translation. So, you know, one example I can give is with the Hunters Point project. So the client there is PG&E, which often is in the news for not great things, and is perhaps the most risk-averse client I've ever worked for. And they, you know, they are a bureaucratic machine. Sometimes I joke, sometimes it's a miracle that having worked for them, I'm sort of find it sometimes a miracle that my lights do come on. And in working with them, like, you know, they will be the first to say they don't do community development. They're an energy company. They deliver energy. That's what they do. And so we got funded out of remediation dollars that's supposed to be used towards community engagement. We just framed community engagement differently. And the core members of PG&E who are part of our team were, you know, one of the early conversations we had with them was, help us understand what looks like success for you. Like when your supervisors are looking over what you're doing, and you know, we all get you're committed to this project. There was even one member who had grown up in this community. And we said, we get that you guys are on board with what we're doing, but like, what are your higher ups looking for to know that you are actually doing well? And what we heard from them is that normally a site like this, there's a pretty robust site management strategy in this interim period between when you shut down a particular utility use and when you either sell it or shift it to another use. And that site management strategy is often involving security, it's maintenance. Sometimes there's like government relations work because you might have neighbors calling city officials complaining about this vacant site or vandalized site, et cetera. So that's a full site management strategy. So when we say, oh, there's this amazing community development work that we're doing, they're like, what? We don't get that, right? Like, how does it fit in the site management bucket? So what we started doing is when we were referring to folks at PG&E and when we're talking about the project, we stopped talking about it from a community engagement or community development perspective. We just said, it's a new way of doing site management. Instead of like having this vacant fallow site where you're worried about extensive security to protect the site that never gets any use, there's still some security, but there's a lot more that's just coming from the community stewardship of the site and use of the site. Instead of getting calls from the mayor, who's getting calls from community members who are angry about looking at this vacant site, you're getting reports of somebody's child attending the circus and how awesome that was, or being able to see an outdoor movie there and how great that was, or now there's like COVID testing happening and that's awesome. And so you're checking that government relations bucket. And so it was like, if all we tried to do was refer to it as community development, we were going to be at loggerheads because there was no bucket for them to understand, and there was no way that the higher ups would sort of see this like in the things they use to judge success. By translating it, we were able to give them a frame that they could use to talk about it in-house, and it got a lot of play within the company as a result of like, oh, maybe we should be looking at this for some of our other sites as well, where we have a very similar condition. I would also say a second thing that I can use that project for as well is I think it's really important to de-risk failure. I think one of the reasons why people stick to their guns of the way things have always been done is that even if the status quo leaves people feeling like, still feels better than like, holy shit, I have no idea what's going to happen if we try that new thing we've never ever done before. And my ass will be kicked by the higher ups if I present to them a failure. So in that project, when we were doing a lot of the community events, it's often been around like using it as an opportunity to test out ideas in a small way that could perhaps lead to bigger risk. So that first year, the opportunity to the circus kind of accidentally landed in our lap. It normally was done at the site of a community partner, but they were undergoing renovation, so their site was closed. And so they were looking, the circus was looking for another place in the Bayview to be. And we're like, circus, brilliant idea. Fun, kids, great use of the site. When we went and presented that to our colleagues at PG&E, they were like, you want to do a what, where? Like heart attacks galore, because they were just like their heads and imagining a circus there, they couldn't do it. And so we said, look, we'll do it really small. And it's just this one little event. And if it fails, well, then we never do it again, right? Like nobody really has to talk about it. We can learn from it, but like, it's not like we're going to be doing all this every single week. We just want to try it this one little time. We'll put in all of the checks around it that you need to feel comfortable about it, and then we'll give it a go. And so we did. And like, I mean, I swear right up until the gates opening up, they were all freaking out. And it opened out and it was incredible. We got that first year, 600 people, which is more than you normally see for any event in the neighborhood. Some of the PG&E folks came, and for them, like the energy that they were seeing in the event and the things that they were happening and the mix of people who were there was just nothing they had seen or felt before. And so they were like, oh, okay, yeah, you can do a circus. So like, 6 months later, when we pitched a petting zoo, which had also been suggested by folks in the community, they didn't bat an eye. They just sort of said, make sure you fill out this paperwork. And so, and we've been able to like expand our ambition of what we're doing each year by sort of saying, we start small, offer this one thing, and are really clear about it both being a test and the evaluation afterwards, whether it fails or is successful. And then each event becomes sort of a building on top of that. So going back to the question, I think part of it is like, what are the little ways that you can experiment? And then don't just experiment and call it a day, like also bring people into the zone of experimentation, like let them feel it, be sure to evaluate it afterwards so you can like be really clear about what worked and what didn't, and then use that as a conditioning for like the next time you present something that goes a little bit further, you're really clear of how it's a build.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to pivot here a little bit, and I want to start thinking, especially because of our hosts here, I want to start thinking a little bit about the role of parks in spatial justice and sort of what some of your experiences around that. So the question we have here is, in the cities you've worked in, what are innovative ways that you've seen parks used to achieve greater spatial justice?
Yeah, well, I mean, I almost wonder if an opening part of that might be about the fact that oftentimes, so I'm often working in low-income communities of color that, like, as I said, often have this huge list of lack. So a lot of times the kind of foreground condition is that either there are no parks or the parks that exist there are pretty crappy. And so part of the tool part of looking at spatial justice as a tool ends up being like, well, one, how do we either insert a park or improve a park? And two, how do we do more than just a park, right? Like, because oftentimes if you're going into a condition where you're even asking the question about having to do a park to rectify spatial justice, there's usually a lot of other things that are on that list of lack. And so my belief with design is like, if we want it to be more than just a design exercise, we have to make sure to, similar to what I described with the Friendship Court project, you leverage it to be able to achieve multiple outcomes. Because if all it does is produces a park, then while you have something pretty for a magazine or a portfolio, it doesn't actually meaningfully change people's lives. So for instance, one community that I'm working in is East Palo Alto, which is about 45 minutes to an hour south of San Francisco. It's located on the edge of Silicon Valley. Facebook is located, campus is located on the edge of it. Another classic example of a community defined by the lack of spatial justice. So if you, you see the real estate prices in San Francisco, just imagine it even crazier in Silicon Valley. And if you're a cleaner at Facebook, this town is probably one of the few places you could afford to live in the surrounding area. And so my owner there, my paying client there is a for-profit property owner. And the property consists of 1,800 units. And a little bit of context of East Palo Alto is that back in the 60s, when the freeway was extended from San Francisco to Silicon Valley, they decided to build it smack dab in the middle of this city. So they essentially have bifurcated the city as well as the resources. This property is on the west side, most of the resources on the east side. And the property owner that I'm working for took over after like 2 successive quasi-slumlords. So I was brought on to help support what could improve quality of life for the residents. And we did a bunch of listening sessions. And one of the things that we identified was that there are also not a lot of sidewalks in this part of town. And so the kids are often playing in the street, and the parents, who consist of a lot of shift workers, were really concerned because they weren't there all the time to monitor the kids' safety. And so we also heard that, like, because they're shift workers, they were also living often in very overcrowded conditions, that they just felt like they had not a lot of places for respite, and were really stressed, and just didn't come into contact with nature that much. And it was a bit of a slog to go all the way to the other side of town to get to any of the parks. So we worked with the property owner to identify a site that was vacant, that they owned. And we did a community design process to create a pop-up park. And the park was a great success initially. But for us, one of the important things wasn't just the presence of having that space to play or to go and have a barbecue with your family, also responding to this sense that people are feeling stressed out, feeling not so healthy. We established a partnership with the YMCA and got them to start offering classes and other health things. So basically we were like a YMCA extension outside. And so that, is an example of like seeing, well, what else is the lack and how do we use this investment as a catalyst to bring additional services that can more broadly support the community. And then, 2 other points with this park is, so 1,800 units takes over a pretty wide piece of the property. This park is on the north side. We're getting residents from the south side coming saying, I love this, but I want to park closer to me because I don't actually have a lot of time to schlep up to this thing. And so we said, that's great. Why don't you lobby for it? And they were like, well, is it okay if we send a petition to the property owner? And we're like, great. And for me, that was awesome because I think part of this is I want to build capacity for the residents to be able to advocate for themselves. The idea that I or somebody in my role always has to be there to be that point of advocacy also becomes a place of sort of repeating systems of power and privilege. And so they sent the letter. Property owner was like, all right, yeah. And so we built a second pop-up park on that side of town with even more amenities because it had a larger space. And then the sort of final thing that I will say with this is that, fast forward a couple of years, we reached a point where we actually needed to redevelop some of the buildings, some of the housing. And the experience of going through the park design, seeing park implementation, we were able to point to as a model for like how we can do the process for the building design, which was really helpful in terms of trust building. And then part of the redevelopment was also going to include some open space. And so the things that we had experimented and learned with the park, we're going to be able to like move over into the design of the open space. So it had like multiple effects. And so I think that's one of the important things of looking at when you're developing the parks, that this can happen. And then I'll just say really quickly, zooming back to San Francisco, I mentioned a little earlier that there's a city park next door to the project that I showed, and they're using an equitable development process. And similar to that, in looking at the equitable development process, we're looking at things like arts and culture, economic development, health, and like what are various programs that we can do. Some of that stuff takes place in the park. Some of that is just about like, how could the Department of Park and Rec leverage its power with other city departments to get at certain things that would be of benefit to this neighborhood. So I think, long way around to saying, like, I think one of the important things around the parks is like, how do you look at it just not only as a green space, but an opportunity to leverage resources to actually deliver multiple returns and benefit?
This idea that you brought up in terms of the an equitable development process, I'm sure many people would probably like to know what exactly does that entail, right? And sort of like, what's the framework around that? That's something that maybe if you'd be up for it, you could sort of supply to people just a basic sort of understanding of what that is based on your own experience after this talk.
Yeah, and I would also just point people to looking at the, so India Basin Park is a park in San Francisco. They maintain a website where they're kind of posting updates, and they will post a plan in a couple of months. So I would direct people there. And then also kind of, it's been inspired by the 11th Street Bridge Park process in DC, and they are super prolific with the materials that they've created to describe the process. So if this is something that's interesting to you, I would say go to those two project websites and you'll see a lot of information about how they've set it up.
Great. Thank you, Liz. And that kind of keys us into a very sort of particular issue. And it's really the issue that has kind of gathered us all here together today, which is the issue of downtown Portland and especially downtown Portland in the time of COVID. So I want to kind of direct us there a little bit, because there's a couple of different, well, more than a couple of different questions around that. So I'm going to try to use one question to frame the second question. So let's see if it works the way that I'm envisioning it. So the first question is, in Portland's central city, more than 30,000 people live, and around 10,000 live below the poverty line. Around the same number are BIPOC and business owners, or I should say businesses, however, are overwhelmingly white owned. So how might we take this moment of spatial disruption of empty offices and storefronts to rethink our downtown as a neighborhood that serves and looks like more of its residents? And so I think maybe we can encapsulate that question in the second question, which is, how do you see reinvigorating downtown Portland after COVID and economic downturns and other problems, including racial injustice and otherwise?
Yeah, both good questions. Again, the questions I see from multiple different cities, and I have to say I've like been to Portland once, so I feel like my commentary will be less specific to do this in Portland, but more just like this is a condition that I see a pattern of in multiple places. And so I kind of think that I would sort of argue for a similar move in these places. So I think, the one arching thing that I would say that I responded to in my talk as well is, I think there will be a tendency to think about when we look at the post-COVID condition of like, holy shit, sorry, I'm cussing a lot in this talk. But, we have a lot of vacant storefronts. And so like, how do we do placemaking around it, or how do we bring businesses back, right? Like that's the problem to solve. And so I think it's really important to name that's not actually the problem to solve. That's like sort of manifestation of a bunch of other things. And if you don't get back to the root of what was the original thing that created these conditions in the first place, it becomes hard to solve. I think the other question to ask is, and this, I say ask it, but I actually think there probably is some sort of process around getting to the answer, is if we come to a starting point that the way that the conditions are now are broken, that the way that the conditions were pre-COVID are broken, and we're going to use this opportunity to sort of talk about, well, what would a healed district look like? That we ask that in the broadest sense possible, like actually set up, what does like that healed vision look like? Who needs to be at the table to help articulate that? And I think that means not only the people who own the buildings, right? But it's the people who live there. It's the people who didn't, whose voices usually aren't represented in the decision-making around there. It's the city. And I think that the process has to be something that is bringing those groups together. And that is developing. And I think this is where there needs to be, some facilitator of that conversation who's making sure that the representation is not equal, but equitable, right? And so equitable means that like you really are cognizant of like who's significantly impacted and how, and who has been historically harmed and who has historically benefited, and that this has to be a process that's doing a little bit of recalibration of the balance. And then in terms of like actual actions and placemaking, one of the things, especially if I think about both the pandemic, but even a little bit before, is I feel like there's just a lot of unprocessed grief when it comes to our cities. For sure, pandemic makes it easy to think about grief in the context of all the people that we've lost. And I would even argue, the businesses and the places that we've lost. But like I said, the story is a long story. And so there's grief even before that. And so I think it's worth it to make sure that in whatever process you're doing to articulate the healed future, that there's a way to hold space for the articulation of what grief exists. And like I showed in some of my projects and hopefully talked about a little bit in this Q&A portion, like the articulation of the grief doesn't just have to be through talking. Like that's a great opportunity for artists, right, to come through and to create things that are actually spatial and experiential, that allows an almost event-based in a new way, almost like a living monument, but a living temporary monument, maybe some of them end up being permanent, of like what it means to move through grief. And that it's only when you kind of set up the ability to do that, that you can then start to name, all right, these are the principles that we would like to be part of the healed future. And I think importantly, because the way of getting to that like healed future will be this twisty, windy, years long thing, right? Like the conditions that you're seeing, there are years worth of stuff that created it. So it's going to be many years to actually heal it. It's not going to be a 1-year project or a 2-year project. But I think it's really important that whatever infrastructure you set up, there has to be accountability measures. There has to be a way to say who's going to be held accountable and how are they going to be held accountable, so that like at regular intervals throughout the process, you're able to actually do that. Because I think oftentimes they're the great big bold visions and then we just go. And you fast forward years later, people are dissatisfied and unhappy because while it started with this great promise, nothing materialized the way it was supposed to. People got left out, people got screwed. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's never an accountability system that's put in place to make sure that you're gate checking multiple times, that you're on the right path that everybody agreed to.
That kind of calls to mind something I think that was coming up for me, but I think in sort of some of these pre-conversations that we had as we were figuring out kind of how to design this presentation and this talk, and some of the other hosts that are helping to drive this conversation here today, and your sort of conversation and discussion around grief and healing sort of in some ways, for me at least, puts in the stark contrast this sort of drive by others to really focus more on like a technical approach, to solving problems, and sort of the idea that we can engineer our way out of this, and that technology will swoop in and kind of save the day. And it'd be interesting just to, really briefly kind of hear your thoughts around sort of where those two things intersect. This idea of like dealing with grief, dealing with trauma, dealing with historical racism, dealing with white supremacy and white supremacist structures. And then this other piece of it, which is, as an architect, and I think you probably have a lot to say on this, where there's just a strong desire to focus on the material and to kind of design our way out of it in the sort of material sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think as an architect, and probably this is true of technologists, like everything's a nail and I'm a hammer. All I gotta do is jam it in and it's solved. And I think that, the technical solution often relies on it says that there's no emotion to what we're looking at, right? Like this is almost a scientific problem to be solved. And here are the tools that I've gotten. I know how to look at this problem and do it. What ignoring the grief is sort of saying that it is possible to strip everything of emotion. We know that that is actually not true, right? Like that always comes to play in every context that we're dealing with. And so to sort of say that I'm going to take this route that ignores that piece exists, I think is super harmful. I would also say, I kind of was speaking at an architecture school recently, and I said, I was trained to be a white supremacist. And I don't mean that my school sort of said, hey, let's go in and teach you how to be a white supremacist. I mean, just saying like the very foundation of architecture and planning, and I think I could probably say this for technology too, is rooted in white supremacy principles. There's a great article by Tema Okun that came out a couple of years ago that basically illuminates this list of white supremacy principles. And it talks about paternalism, which I think is something that you could probably hold up a lot of technology and architecture projects by. Power hoarding, either or thinking. Like I could go down this list and I could say, yep, that shows up in architecture. Yep, that shows up in technology. And so I think that, there's a reckoning moment we have to have within our professions of stepping away from that strict adherence and not questioning how so much of what we do as a normal course is actually implementing the white supremacy system. And then I think related to that, there's a awakening moment we need to have about the fact that as much as we would like to think that our actions are objective, it is actually impossible for anyone to be objective because we are human beings. And everything that we are working with has been impacted by our life experiences, even the things that we think are defined and super simple, and clean and objective. It doesn't exist. And so I think unless by ignoring it and perpetuating that it is possible to be objective, again, we're just perpetuating the white supremacy system. And so I think it's really important to question all of our decisions and sort of saying well, what actually created this condition that we're reacting to? And while my first inclination might be X, can I take a step back and just see am I replicating those systems? And I think oftentimes even, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? And I often say there's a clear difference between doing good and doing right. And doing good is often the lane that most of us operate in, right? And everyone generally wants to do good by people, does not cause harm. But when we don't step back and question, what is actually influencing how we're reading a situation, what's influencing what we think should be done next, and what is our life experience, our power, our privilege that's gotten us to this point that we're looking at something in a certain way, then we definitely end up operating in the doing good side, which is actually complicit in harm, than the doing right side, which is how am I dismantling the conditions of harm?
We have a couple different questions on sort of reference material that you've mentioned. I don't know, if it's possible, I'm just going to put the question out there, and then whoever is listening might go back through this talk and sort of gather that information and collect it for us. So there's people who want to kind of know and be able to have access to some of the different books and names and projects that you've mentioned. And so that could be, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that would be great. And I'm happy to, whoever is going to be coordinating that, I'm happy to also send. But I was also going to do a shout out to checking out the Center for Urban Pedagogy, also known as CUP, out of New York, and the Creative Reaction Lab out of St. Louis. They both have been doing amazing online webinars during the COVID era that are talking about some of the issues like white supremacy and healing and implicit bias, and how that connects with the design process. So, you know, if you want to like not just read stuff, but like actually be taken through the paces of how might you think about these things, I would strongly recommend checking both of those groups out.
Maybe you can just say one thing. You mentioned an author and a book. The author's last name was Kuhn.
Okun. Tema Okun, T-E-M-A-O, and then last name is O-K-U-N. And I am the paper title has white supremacy in it, but I'm completely blanking on the official title. But that name is unique enough that if you just Google that and white supremacy, you will probably find the article that I'm referencing, because she gets that article gets referenced constantly for anyone who's trying to have, yes, characteristics of white supremaugh. Thank you, somebody found it.
Great. We've got one reference required. We've got one reference in the chat. We're off to a good start. So, you know, we're about at time here, but I do want to kind of round us off with a last question that sort of is a little bit, you know, future oriented. At least for those who are with us today at this discussion, and that is the question of, you know, if you could give us some idea of some helpful strategies on how to continue this dialogue with our varied Oregon communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, I would almost say like a starting place might be identifying who needs to be at the table, but also like I'm willing to bet in some of these places that these conversations are actually already happening. And so I think, you know, if they're happening and you're not a part of it, it's to figure out where they're occurring and go join them. If they are not happening and you want to start it, then I think there's a conversation about who should be at the table, right? And like, how are you building that collective coalition? And if you are already having this conversation, it'd be worthwhile to just evaluate, like, do you have all the people at the table who should be there? Just based on, you know, the things that I have articulated. And then I think a very early step in the process has got to be, you know, framing out this idea of what would be the process to hold harm, which might be a series of conversations, right? Where you're just kind of, there's no agenda other than to like, can we daylight what have been the harm and benefit that has existed in this place, right? And then, you know, when you start to have that initial daylighting, you can then start to, and like doing things like storytelling projects like StoryCorps or something even more, you know, just a simple listening session are all tools you can use towards that. And then I think you can start to move through like, okay, what does this storytelling and listening look like in public, right? Which might be in the form of, you know, as we did, a listening party, or it might be in the form of leveraging artists to create something that allows these stories to be told and heard in different ways. And I would say, you know, what I didn't share with like, say, the Now Hunters Point project is at every event we did, we had some tool that was used to enable us to hear people's stories. So we had these things that I call desire cards, where we would write a little prompt, ... and have people fill it in, right? And you know, now we have a collection of hundreds of those. Or you know, for little kids, we would give them a prompt to draw to so that we could get their voices as well. Or I ran workshop for teenagers where I would say, something like make a tourism map of this place and use that to talk about what are the things that you see that you think are important or special about this neighborhood, right? So constantly deploying these tools that allow you to reach different people in different ways. And then I think once you get to that place, it's about the like reckoning, which is in some ways is almost a continuation of the acknowledgement piece, right? Like that it's going to take place both in conversation and in terms of experiential opportunities set up. And I think that one thing I should also say, going back to the beginning, and maybe this is sits somewhere between the acknowledgement and the reckoning piece, is can the group that has come together identify in collaboration with community members, what are some of the core principles that are going to underpin your process, right? Because I think that's important to use it to be able to say, how do you make sure you're always holding yourself accountable to what you do? But it's hard to like kind of do a one size fit all of do this and this and this and this and but I think the main thing I would say is like just make sure that you have the people you need to hear from, make sure that you've set up a system of accountability. Don't rely just on talk conversation, although that is key. But this is something that can also be done in space. And make sure that even if you're doing events, you're not just doing events for the sake of doing events, that they have a purpose, whether it's to allow a certain experience of this process or to create a place where you can engage people in conversation or offering input or offering their stories in a way that moves the needle further.
Yeah, we're very into replicable models these days, I think, and it's a double-edged sword a little bit, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is like the important thing is how do you hold the frame, right? It has to look different in every place, because even though there are some key things that are part of the urban experience in a lot of different places, it is still manifested in a way that is very unique to that place. And so that's why I kind of often say it's about acknowledging, reckoning, and repairing, right? But what acknowledgement looks like, what reckoning looks like, and what repair looks like is going to be actually quite unique to your community.
You know, I want to just highlight, you know, and sort of put in bold one of the things you said, which is there are conversations that are probably already happening, and there are people out there locally who are already doing this work, right? And one organization that comes to mind is City Repair here in Portland that really I think exemplifies many of the things that you're talking about with this sort of like intersection of placemaking, storytelling, art, and spatial justice. They're probably not the only one out there, but it's one that comes to mind. So I thought at least to raise up one organization here locally that is doing that work and is having this conversation, that's probably capable of helping others to have this conversation as well.
Yeah, and I would just say, you know, I fly into lots of different places, and one of my thing is always like, who's already doing the work, right? Like my role is to amplify that and direct resources to them, not to like kind of create this whole new special siloed vision. And I think just the more like anyone who wants to get engaged in this, really it's coming from a lens of how can I be in service to, right? Instead of like, I think as a designer, I was trained to be, you know, almost the Howard Rourke effect of like, it's coming from my grand idea. and I think, you know, our ego needs to take a seat, and really it's like, I've got these resources. Who can I help? How can I help?
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Well, I want to just be mindful of time. We're sort of at a close here. I just want to thank you, Liz. This is, I mean, this has been an incredible conversation. You're an incredible person, and I think you've really just brought alive for everybody this idea of spatial justice, design, and sort of trying to take some of these ideas and concepts and bring them into our own place and trying to figure out how we move forward as a community as well. So thank you so much. We just want to extend a huge debt of gratitude and appreciation to you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have this conversation, and thank you for moderating, because I know it is not easy to sift through those questions and get to a cohesion thread. So.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. It's with you, my pleasure for sure.
And I want to thank both of you, Liz and Manuel, for a really stimulating evening. We also have to say happy birthday, not to Liz, but to her mom, without whom we would not have Liz here. So happy birthday, Liz's mom.
She will both be appreciative and incredibly embarrassed by that, but thank you.
So I want to thank again you two. I want to thank our partners, Converge 45, Portland Art Museum, RAC, and Urbanism Next, and particularly shout out to Urbanism Next and Portland Art Museum for the financial help, and to everybody who chipped in a little bit in their registration. And one more time, great talk, great conversation. Really appreciate your time and your energy, both of you. And we'll see you in the future. Oh, and one last thing. We are convening these conversations. You can find information by writing us at thinktank@portlandpf.org. Again, thank you. Have a great evening. Happy birthday to your mom. And take care. Good night, everyone.
I know.